He raised his glass and laughed, telling the room his ex-wife was a nobody, just a mistake he erased, and the crowd chuckled with him as she stood there in silence, fingers steady on a bidding card worth millions. Then the auctioneer's voice cut through the room, announcing the winning bid backed by Hayes Group. The air shifted, whispers spread, and before Jason could speak again, a tall man stepped forward, calm, untouchable, placing a hand on her shoulder like it had always belonged there. "My wife will handle the payment," he said. And in that second the laughter died. The room turned, and Jason realized too late he had just humiliated the most powerful woman in the room. He told everyone she was a nobody, while she was standing right there. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Ballroom cast a golden glow over silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, the soft clink of champagne glasses blending into the low hum of wealth and quiet judgment. And at the center of it all stood Jason Miller, confident, polished, completely in control, his voice carrying just enough of the surrounding circle to hear as he smirked. "We all have chapters we regret. Mine just happened to be married to me." A ripple of laughter followed, light, polite, cruel in its restraint. And then someone asked, "Where is she now?" And Jason didn't hesitate, didn't even blink as he lifted his glass slightly and said, "Oh, Emily? She's nobody, always was." And for a moment the room seemed to agree with him, heads nodding, eyes scanning past her like she didn't exist, like she was just another shadow in a room built for people who mattered. But Emily Carter was there, standing no more than 10 feet away, her reflection caught faintly in the polished marble column beside her, her dress understated, deep navy silk that didn't scream for attention but held it anyway, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of a bidder's paddle she hadn't yet raised, her breathing steady, controlled, as if every word he spoke was something she had already heard 1,000 times before. Only now it echoed louder, sharper, because it was public, because it was intentional, because it was meant to erase her completely. And still, she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't give the audience the reaction they were quietly waiting for. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the stage where the charity auction was about to begin, the auctioneer adjusting his microphone, smiling that polished, rehearsed smile that belonged to people who never had to wonder if they belonged in a room like this. And as the first item was presented, a vintage timepiece encased in glass, the bidding began slow, predictable, numbers rising in comfortable increments, 10,000, 15, 20, until a pause settled over the room. A brief lull where attention wavered. And that was when Emily lifted her paddle for the first time. The movement small, almost invisible, but enough for the auctioneer to catch, to call out her bid. A number that didn't just continue the pattern, but broke it entirely, jumping higher than expected. Enough to turn heads, enough to make the room notice her, really notice her. And Jason's smile faltered just slightly as he followed their gaze, his eyes landing on her like he was seeing something that didn't quite make sense, something that didn't fit the narrative he had just so confidently written. And for the first time that night, the laughter stopped, replaced by something quieter, sharper, curiosity edged with disbelief. And Emily didn't look at him. Not yet. Her focus remained on the stage, her posture unchanged, calm, precise, as if she wasn't interrupting anything at all, but simply continuing a story no one else had realized had already begun. And somewhere near the back of the room, a set of doors opened, softly, almost unnoticed, as if timing itself had decided to shift, and the night, carefully constructed around Jason's version of truth, began to unravel in silence. The room did not return to normal after her first bid. It shifted, subtly at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Conversations grew quieter, eyes lingered longer, and the auctioneer, now more alert, called out the next item with a sharpened tone. A private art piece estimated at $50,000, a number that once would have felt distant, unreachable. But Emily did not hesitate, her paddle rising again with the same controlled precision, her voice unnecessary as the number carried through the room, doubling the opening bid without effort. And this time the reaction was not polite curiosity, but unmistakable attention. Heads turned fully, bodies angled toward her. Whispers began to form, small, urgent, threaded with disbelief, and Jason felt it before he fully understood it, the shift of focus away from him, the way his audience was no longer his fingers tightening slightly around the stem of his glass as he watched her, really watched her now, not as a memory or a mistake, but as a presence that refused to stay small, and something in his chest tightened. Not fear, not yet, but confusion edged with irritation, because this was not how the story was supposed to go. She was supposed to fade, to shrink, to validate everything he had just said, but instead she stood there, calm, unbothered, bidding amounts that did not align with the version of her he had carefully constructed. Must be a fluke, someone near him murmured, but even that sounded uncertain, and the auction continued, each item becoming less about the object and more about her. Because each time the room expected her to stop, she did not, her paddle lifting again, steady, deliberate, pushing numbers higher, stretching comfort into discomfort, until even. The seasoned donors began to hesitate before competing, and Jason felt the need to reclaim control, stepping forward slightly, forcing a laugh that did not quite land the same way it had minutes before. Some people like to pretend, he said, louder now, trying to anchor the room back to him. Credit cards and bad decisions. You know how it goes. A few scattered chuckles followed, thinner, less certain, and for the first time Emily's gaze shifted, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough to acknowledge him, her eyes meeting his with a calm that did not challenge, did not argue, but simply existed, and that was what unsettled him the most, because there was no desperation there, no need to prove anything, only a quiet certainty that made his words feel smaller the moment they left his mouth, and before he could speak again, the auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice carrying a new note of formality. Ladies and gentlemen, just a brief clarification, he said, glancing toward the back of the room where a quiet exchange had taken place. All bids placed under paddle 73 are secured and verified. A pause, just long enough to draw every eye in the room toward Emily. On behalf of Hayes Group, the name landed differently, heavier, familiar in a way that commanded attention without asking for it, and a ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable, as recognition spread, as calculations began, as people quietly reconsidered everything they had assumed moments before, and Jason felt it then, that first real crack in certainty, his expression tightening, his mind racing to connect pieces that refused to align, because Hayes Group did not make mistakes, did not back unknowns. And yet here she was, standing in the center of a room that had just called her nothing, holding the attention of everyone who mattered without raising her voice once. And she still had not looked back at him again, as if he no longer required acknowledgement, as if the version of her he had tried to define had already slipped beyond his reach. And near the entrance, just past the soft glow of the chandeliers, a figure began to move forward, unhurried, unnoticed by most, but not for long. The name lingered in the air like a quiet command. Hayes Group? And the room responded the way it always did to power, with silence first. Then attention sharpened into something almost reverent, and Jason felt it slip further from his grasp, the narrative, the control, the certainty he had walked in with, all of it dissolving as the figure from the entrance stepped fully into the light. Alexander Hayes did not rush, did not announce himself. He did not need to. His presence moved through the room before he did, a subtle shift in posture from those who recognized him, shoulders straightening, conversation stopping mid-sentence, and the auctioneer himself seemed to recalibrate, his smile tightening into something more formal, more careful, as Alexander approached the center of the room, his gaze steady, unreadable, passing over faces without lingering until it reached her, and only then did it soften, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but enough to signal something that the room could feel but not yet name. Emily did not turn immediately. She did not rush to meet him. Instead, she finished signing the bitter confirmation with calm precision, the pen gliding across the paper as if nothing had changed, as if everything had already been decided long before this moment, and only when she set the pen down did she lift her eyes, meeting his with a quiet familiarity that did not need explanation. And for a brief second the room held its breath because there was something in that look, something that did not belong to strangers or chance connections, something established, grounded, real, and Jason saw it too, felt it like a crack widening beneath his feet, his mind rejecting it even as his instincts recognized it. Because there was no version of reality where Emily Carter, the woman he had dismissed, could be standing at the center of this moment with Alexander Hayes looking at her like that. "Mr. Hayes," the auctioneer began, stepping forward with practiced respect, "we appreciate your—" But Alexander lifted a hand slightly, not dismissive, simply redirecting, his attention never leaving Emily as he closed the final distance between them. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, even carrying just enough to reach the surrounding crowd without effort. "Everything is in place?" he asked, not to the room, not to the host, but to her. And Emily gave the smallest nod, composed, certain. "Yes," she said softly, and that was. When he turned, just slightly, enough for the room to fully see them side by side, his hand resting lightly at her back in a gesture that was neither possessive nor performative, but natural, practiced, undeniable. "Good," he said. And then, with the same quiet authority that had already shifted the entire evening, he added, "My wife will handle the transfer." The word landed without emphasis, without pause, but it echoed louder than anything spoken that night, because it did not need to be repeated, it did not need to be explained. It simply existed, absolute, and the reaction was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but profound, a collective stillness as the room recalibrated around a truth it had not seen coming. Eyes moving between them, recalculating status, power, history, and Jason stood frozen within it, the glass still in his hand, his earlier laughter now something distant, irrelevant, as the weight of what he had said just minutes ago settled back over him. Heavier this time, because now the room had context, now the room understood, and Emily did not look at him, not even once as she stepped forward beside Alexander, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if this was never about proving anything, never about correcting him, only about being exactly who she had become. And in that silence, surrounded by people who no longer saw her as invisible, Jason realized something far worse than being wrong. He had been insignificant to the truth all along. Silence did not break immediately after the word settled. It stretched, deepened, wrapping around the room like a quiet realization no one wanted to interrupt. And then, slowly, the world resumed, but differently, softer voices, more careful movements, people adjusting their posture as if proximity to truth required recalibration. And Jason felt it in the smallest details, the way no one looked at him first anymore, the way conversations shifted away from him without acknowledgement, the way even the woman at his side, once so eager to mirror his confidence, now stood just slightly apart, her smile frozen, uncertain where to place herself in a story that had suddenly rewritten itself. And across the room, Emily remained composed, her presence no longer questioned, no longer peripheral, as if the space itself had expanded to accommodate her fully, Alexander speaking briefly with the event organizers, his tone low, controlled, not performative, while she stood beside him with the ease of someone who belonged not just to the moment, but to the structure behind it, the foundation no one had seen. And the auction resumed, but it no longer felt like entertainment. It felt like formality, numbers called out with a kind of respectful restraint, as if the earlier energy had been replaced by something more precise, more aware. And when Emily lifted her paddle again, no one questioned it, no one laughed. They simply watched, because now they understood that her actions were not gestures, they were decisions backed by something real, something powerful. And Jason tried to move, to step forward, to reclaim even a fragment of the control he had lost, but the path that had once opened for him so easily now seemed occupied, filled with people who no longer made space, his voice catching slightly as he attempted a casual remark, something light, something to pull attention back, but it fell flat, unnoticed, dissolving into the ambient sound of a room that had already moved on. And he realized then that it was not just the reveal that had undone him. It was the silence that followed, the absence of reaction from her, the complete lack of acknowledgement that made everything he had said feel insignificant, because she had not defended herself. She had not corrected him. She had simply existed in a truth that required no validation, and that truth was now visible to everyone, undeniable. And near the stage, the auctioneer concluded another item, his voice steady, professional, but his glance toward Emily carried something else now, respect, and perhaps a hint of caution, as if recognizing that influence did not always arrive loudly. And as the final signatures were prepared, Alexander turned slightly toward her again, speaking quietly, something only she could hear, and she responded. With a small nod, her expression unchanged, calm, assured, as if every outcome had already been accounted for. And for a brief moment, as the crowd shifted and repositioned, Jason found himself with a clear line of sight to her. Nothing between them, no noise, no distraction, just distance. And he expected, even now, some flicker of the past, some acknowledgement of what they had been. But there was none. Her gaze passed over him without pause, not cold, not bitter, simply uninterested in that. Absence landed heavier than anything else that night, because it confirmed what the room had already begun to understand, that the woman he had reduced to nothing had not only rebuilt her life, she had outgrown the need for him to matter in it at all. And as the event continued under a new, quieter energy, one thing remained clear in every glance, every whisper, every recalculated interaction. The story had changed. And this time, he was no longer the one telling it. The night did not end with applause or spectacle. It settled into something quieter, something far more enduring, as the final item was auctioned and the soft swell of conversation returned. But now it carried a different tone, measured, reflective, and everywhere Emily moved, attention followed. Not the fleeting curiosity from before, but a steady, deliberate respect. People approached her carefully, voices lower, questions more thoughtful, as if trying to understand the woman they had overlooked only moments earlier. And she answered with the same calm composure, never overstating, never correcting, allowing the truth to exist without explanation. And beside her, Alexander remained a quiet constant, not overshadowing, not leading, but aligned, his presence reinforcing what had already been revealed without the need for repetition. And across the room, Jason stood on the edge of it all. No longer central, no longer the voice that shaped perception, his earlier confidence now. Something distant, replaced by a tightening awareness of how quickly a narrative could collapse when it was built on assumptions. And he tried, once more, to step forward, to speak to her, his movement hesitant now, unfamiliar, as if he was navigating a space that no longer belonged to him. Emily, he said, her name leaving his mouth softer than before, stripped of the certainty it once carried, and for the first time she turned fully toward him, her expression not guarded, not emotional, simply present. And that was what unsettled him most, because there was no trace of the woman he remembered trying to prove herself, no echo of the past he had relied on to define her, only someone entirely separate from it. You could have said something, he added, the words coming out uneven, searching for ground that was no longer there. And Emily held his gaze for a brief moment, not to challenge, not to confront, but to acknowledge. And then she spoke, her voice quiet, steady, carrying just enough to reach him and know. Further, I did not need to, she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no triumph, only truth, simple and complete. And in that moment, Jason understood something he had not expected, that everything he had said earlier, every word meant to diminish her, had only revealed how little he had ever understood about her at all. And as she turned away, returning to the conversation beside her, the space between them felt final, not because of what had happened that night, but because of what had already changed long before it. And the ballroom continued around them, the lights still warm, the music still soft, but the energy had shifted permanently. The story no longer belonged to the man who spoke the loudest, but to the woman who never needed to raise her voice. And as the doors opened and guests began to leave, one truth lingered quietly in every mind that had witnessed it. That the person they had once dismissed had not come back to prove them wrong. She had simply returned as someone they could no longer ignore. The night air outside the Grand Meridian Ballroom felt different, cooler, quieter, as if the city itself had stepped back to make space for everything that had just unfolded, and Emily paused at the top of the wide stone steps, her hand resting lightly against the smooth railing, the distant hum of traffic blending with the fading echo of laughter behind the closed doors. But none of it followed her the way it once would have. None of it clung to her like expectation or doubt. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a slow breath, steady and full, not to recover, but to acknowledge, because nothing about tonight had been accidental. Nothing had been reactive. It had all been chosen, built quietly over months. That no one in that room had witnessed. And behind her the doors opened again, a soft shift of light spilling onto the pavement as Alexander stepped out. His presence as composed here as it had been inside, his jacket draped perfectly, his expression calm but observant, as if he had been watching more than just the event, as if he had been measuring the space between who she had been and who she stood as now. And he did not speak immediately. He simply moved to stand beside her, matching her. Stillness, allowing the moment to settle without interruption. And after a brief pause he said, "You handled that exactly the way you said you would," his voice low, even, not congratulating, not surprised, just stating what had always been understood. And Emily let a faint smile touch her lips, not wide, not triumphant, but real. "I did not come to prove anything," she replied, her gaze drifting out toward the city lights stretching beyond the street. "I just was not willing to stay invisible." And the words lingered between them, simple but layered, because they carried everything she had chosen not to say inside, everything she had left unspoken in a room that once defined her. And Alexander nodded slightly, as if that answer had been expected, as if it aligned with something he had already seen in her long before tonight. And a black car pulled smoothly to the curb, its presence understated but precise, the driver stepping out quietly, opening the door without drawing attention. And for a moment Emily did not move, her eyes shifting back toward the entrance of the ballroom, where shadows moved behind the glass, where voices still carried faintly, and she knew that inside, conversations were still unfolding, people reconstructing the story, adjusting their perceptions, attaching new meaning to moments they had misunderstood. But she also knew that none of it required her anymore. None of it could redefine what had already been established. And somewhere within that realization was a quiet release, not of anger, not of pain, but of relevance, because the version of her that had once needed to be seen, to be acknowledged, no longer existed in that space. And when she finally stepped forward, it was without hesitation, without looking back. Her movement smooth, certain. As she entered the car, Alexander following a second. Later, the door closing softly behind them, sealing the moment without ceremony. And as the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights reflecting across the glass like distant constellations, Emily allowed herself one last thought, not about Jason, not about the room, but about the path that had led her here, the quiet decisions, the unseen work, the strength built in silence. And for the first time, it did not feel like something she had to carry. It felt like something she had already become. The city moved around them in quiet streaks of light as the car glided through downtown, reflections sliding across the window like fragments of another life. And inside, the silence was not empty. It was settled, intentional, the kind that came after something had finally aligned. And Emily sat with her hands resting loosely in her lap, no longer holding anything, no longer bracing, just present, while Alexander across from her studied her not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if confirming something he had known long before tonight. "You did not react the way they expected," he said after a moment, his tone calm, observational, and Emily's gaze remained on the passing skyline, her voice steady when she answered. "I spent too many years reacting," she said. Tonight was not about them. And that truth lingered, filling the space between them without needing further explanation, because both of them understood what it meant to build something quietly, to move without announcing every step, and outside the car the city shifted from bright avenues to quieter streets, the rhythm slowing, and with it came something else, memory, not sharp or overwhelming, but present, threading its way through her thoughts as the night unfolded behind her. And she saw it clearly now, the years that had once felt like a blur, the subtle ways she had been diminished, not in loud moments, but in quiet ones, conversations where her ideas were redirected, decisions made without her voice, the slow erosion of confidence disguised as practicality, and she remembered how easily she had accepted it at the time, how she had believed that shrinking was part of maintaining something, part of keeping peace, and across from her Alexander did not interrupt that silence. He did not ask what she was thinking. He simply allowed it, understanding that some reflections were not meant to be spoken out loud. And as the car turned onto a quieter block lined with glass front buildings and understated entrances, Emily exhaled softly, not with regret, but with clarity, because the version of her that had once accepted those moments no longer existed. She had rebuilt herself in ways no one had witnessed, piece by piece, choice by choice, and tonight had not created that transformation. It had only revealed it. And the car came to a smooth stop in front of a private entrance, the kind that did not announce wealth, but carried it quietly, the driver stepping out, opening the door with the same precise movement as before, and for a moment Emily remained seated, her reflection faint in the glass, her expression composed but softer now, as if the weight of something had finally lifted, and when she stepped out onto the sidewalk the air felt different again, cooler, steadier, and Alexander followed, pausing beside her, his voice low as he said, "They will talk about tonight," and Emily gave a slight nod, not dismissive, just acknowledging what was obvious. "They always do," she replied, and then after a brief pause she added, "But it does not change anything." And that was the difference. That was what separated this moment from everyone that came before, because once those conversations would have defined her, shaped how she moved, how she saw herself. But now they existed outside of her, separate, irrelevant. And as they stepped toward the entrance, the glass doors opening smoothly before them, one thing became undeniably clear. This was never about proving them wrong. It was about no longer needing them to be right. The lobby welcomed them with a quiet kind of elegance, marble floors reflecting soft amber light, the faint scent of polished wood, and something warmer, almost like cedar lingering in the air, and Emily stepped inside without hesitation, her heels echoing gently in the open space, not drawing attention, but marking presence, while the concierge offered a respectful nod, already aware of who she was without needing introduction, and that subtle recognition carried more weight than any announcement, because it was earned, not given in a single moment, but built over time, and as the doors closed behind them, sealing out the distant noise of the city, a different kind of stillness settled, one that allowed thoughts to surface more clearly, and Emily felt it, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that came after a long period of quiet work finally aligned with visible reality. And she moved toward the private elevator, her reflection briefly catching in the mirrored panels, not as someone transformed overnight, but as someone fully seen for the first time, and Alexander joined her side without speaking, his presence steady, familiar, as if he understood that this moment did not need commentary, only space and when. The elevator doors slid open. They stepped inside together, the soft hum of motion beginning as the city dropped away beneath them, each floor passing in silent succession. And for a moment Emily allowed her shoulders to relax, just slightly, not from exhaustion, but from release, because there was nothing left to brace against, nothing left to anticipate, and the memory of the ballroom no longer carried tension. It felt distant, contained, like a chapter that had already closed the moment it had been understood. And Alexander glanced toward her, his expression thoughtful. "You knew this would happen," he said quietly, not as a question, but as recognition, and Emily's gaze remained forward, her voice calm, measured. "Not exactly like that," she replied, "but I knew I would not walk out the same way I walked in." And that distinction mattered, because it was never about the reaction of the room, never about their shock or their whispers. It was about the decision she had made long Before stepping into that space, the decision to no longer participate in a version of herself that had been defined by someone else. And as the elevator slowed, the final floor approaching, a soft chime marking their arrival, Emily felt a quiet certainty settle deeper, something unshakable, not built on the events of one night, but reinforced by them. And when the doors opened into a private residence framed by glass and city lights stretching endlessly beyond, she stepped forward without pause, the space reflecting a life that had been built deliberately, every detail intentional, every choice her own, and behind her Alexander followed, closing the distance between what had been and what now existed, not as a contrast, but as a continuation. And for a brief moment Emily stood at the edge of the window, looking out over the city that had once felt overwhelming, distant, unattainable, and now felt simply like a backdrop to something she had already claimed. And she realized then that tonight had not changed her position. It had only revealed it to others, to the room, to the past that had once defined her. And as that understanding settled, one quiet truth remained. She had never been what they called her. She had only been waiting until she no longer had to explain it. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a quiet constellation of light and motion. But inside the apartment, everything felt still, grounded, as if time itself had slowed to match the steady rhythm Emily had finally claimed for herself. And she stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because she was lost in thought, but because she no longer felt the need to rush past anything, every second now belonging fully to her. And behind her Alexander moved through the space with quiet familiarity, setting his jacket aside, pouring 2 glasses of water without asking, placing one within her reach as if it had always been understood. And when she turned slightly to take it, their eyes met briefly, not with intensity, not with expectation, but with a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken. And she took a slow sip, the coolness grounding, present, real, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Because there was nothing left to analyze about the night, no loose ends to tie, only a quiet awareness of what had shifted and what had not. And Emily set the glass down carefully, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the marble counter, the texture familiar, intentional, everything in this space chosen, built, earned, and that word lingered. Earned because it had never been about luck or sudden change. It had been about decisions made when no one was watching, about rebuilding something from the inside out without needing immediate validation. And she could see it clearly now, the long stretch of time that had once felt uncertain, the early mornings, the quiet meetings, the moments where progress was invisible but real. And she realized that tonight had not created any of that. It had simply illuminated it, brought it into a room that had once refused to see her. And Alexander's voice broke the silence gently. "You never told me what you were thinking when he spoke," he said, not probing, just curious in a way that respected distance. And Emily considered the question for a moment, not searching for an answer, but choosing one. "Nothing," she said finally, her tone calm, certain, "because it did not belong to me anymore." And that was the truth, simple and complete, because the version of herself that would have reacted, that would have felt the need to defend or correct, had already been left behind long before she stepped into that ballroom. And as she moved away from the window, walking slowly through the open space, her reflection following her in the glass, she noticed something subtle but undeniable. There was no tension in her posture, no trace of the weight she had once carried in rooms like that. Only ease, only presence. And she paused near a table where a set of documents lay neatly arranged, the quiet evidence of everything she had been building, contracts, plans, decisions that extended far beyond one evening. And she rested her hand lightly against the surface, not to hold onto it, but to acknowledge it, because this was the part no one had seen, the part that mattered most. And Alexander watched her for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if confirming what he had already known. "They will try to understand it," he said, referring not just to the night, but to her, to the shift they had all witnessed. And Emily gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "They will try to explain it," she replied. "But they were not there when it was built." And that distinction, settled quietly into the room, because it marked the line between perception and truth, between what was visible and what had always existed beneath it. And as the city lights continued to move beyond the glass, one realization remained steady, unwavering. She had not stepped into a new life tonight. She had simply stepped into full view of the one she had already created. Morning arrived without ceremony, the soft light of early sun filtering through the expansive glass, casting long reflections across the polished floors. And for the first time in a long while, Emily did not wake with a sense of anticipation or pressure. There was no need to prepare for a version of herself that others expected, no need to brace for conversations that required careful navigation. Instead, there was only clarity, quiet and steady, and she moved through the space with an ease that felt unfamiliar in its simplicity, her bare footsteps soft against the floor as she paused by the window. The city below already in motion, cars threading through streets, people beginning their routines, unaware of how much had shifted for her. And yet everything remained exactly as it should, because nothing about this morning was about change. It was about confirmation. And behind her, the low hum of a phone resting on the marble counter broke the stillness. A notification lighting the screen. Briefly before fading, then another and another, the pattern building into something persistent, not chaotic but insistent. And when she finally turned, her gaze settled on the device without urgency, because she already understood what it would contain: messages, headlines, names she recognized and others she did not, all attempting to capture what had happened the night before, to define it, to label it in ways that made it easier to understand. And she walked over slowly, picking up the phone with a calm hand, her eyes scanning the first few lines without reaction. Unexpected appearance, mystery connection, private alliance revealed. The words varied, but the intention was the same, to explain something that had never been meant for them to explain. And she set the phone back down just as easily as she had picked it up, because none of it required her attention. None of it altered what already existed. And across the room, Alexander stepped into view, his presence as composed in daylight as it had been the night before. A quiet nod acknowledging her without interrupting the stillness she had settled into. "They're trying to understand it," he said, his voice even, and Emily allowed a faint smile. Not amused, not dismissive, just aware. "They always need a story," she replied, her gaze returning briefly to the city. But it was never for them, and that distinction held, stronger now in the clarity of morning, because it removed the final layer of expectation, the idea that anything she had done required validation or recognition beyond its own truth. And as she moved toward the table where her work was laid out, the same documents from the night before now illuminated by natural light. She ran her fingers lightly across the surface, grounding herself not in the outcome of one evening, but in the continuity of everything she had built, the projects, the decisions, the future already in motion. And she realized that this was where her focus had always been, not in correcting the past, not in confronting what had been said, but in creating something so solid that the past simply lost its relevance. And as the morning continued to unfold, one quiet understanding remained at the center of it all. Nothing had been taken back. Nothing had been rewritten. She had not reclaimed anything. She had simply moved forward far enough that what was behind her no longer held any weight. And in that space, untouched by noise or opinion, she stood exactly where she was meant to be. By mid-morning, the city had fully awakened, and with it came the ripple effect of the night before, subtle at first, then undeniable, as Emily stepped into her office space, a floor above the residence, where glass walls framed a quieter version of the skyline, and the air carried the faint hum of intention. Assistants moved with quiet efficiency, screens lit with data, schedules adjusted in real time. And yet when she entered, everything aligned without disruption, not because they were waiting for her, but because they were already moving in rhythm with her decisions. And she paused briefly at the threshold, taking in the space not with pride, but with awareness, because this was the part no one in that ballroom had seen, the part that had taken shape long before a single headline tried to define her. And as she moved toward the central desk, a tablet was handed to her, the assistant's voice calm. "There are a few requests that came in this morning," and Emily accepted it with a slight nod, her eyes scanning the screen. Names, companies, invitations, all framed carefully, each one attempting to position itself closer to her. And there was no surprise in it, no sense of vindication, only recognition of a pattern she had learned long ago. People aligned themselves with what they understood as power, and now they understood, but what mattered was that her direction had never depended on their understanding, and she set the tablet down after a moment, selecting only what aligned with what she had already planned, discarding the rest without hesitation. Because attention was not something she needed to chase, it was something she could now choose. And across the room, Alexander stood near one of the windows, reviewing a set of documents of his own, his presence integrated into the space without dominating it. And when he glanced toward her, there was a brief acknowledgement, not of last night, but of the continuity that followed it, and Emily moved through the office with the same steady pace, her voice measured as she gave direction, adjusting timelines, confirming decisions, each word precise, efficient, leaving no space for uncertainty. And as the morning progressed, the noise from outside continued to build, messages increasing, calls routed, attempts made to reach her through different channels. But inside, none of it disrupted the flow, because the work had always been the center, not the perception of it. And at one point, her assistant hesitated slightly, holding a note. "There is a request from Jason Miller," she said carefully, the name landing without emphasis, without weight. And for a brief second, the room seemed to still, not out of tension, but out of recognition of a connection that no longer held relevance. And Emily did not react immediately. She simply looked at the note, her expression unchanged, and then she set it aside, not dismissively, but deliberately. "No response," she said, her voice calm, final, and the assistant nodded, understanding that this was not avoidance, not unfinished business, but closure already decided. And as the day continued to unfold, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone within that space. What had happened the night before was not the beginning of her power, it was only the moment others realized it existed. And as Emily returned her focus to the work in front of her, the last remaining connection to her past faded quietly into irrelevance, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through absence. And in that absence, there was a kind of finality that required nothing more. The afternoon light shifted subtly across the office, casting longer shadows that stretched across the polished surfaces, and the steady rhythm of work continued without interruption. Decisions made, directions given, outcomes set into motion with quiet precision. And Emily remained at the center of it all, not as a figure of authority that demanded attention, but as a presence that guided it, her movements measured, her voice calm, every action aligned with something larger than the moment itself. And as the hours passed, the earlier noise from the outside world began to settle into something more distant, less urgent, as if even the speculation had begun to lose momentum in the absence of response. And that was the pattern, she realized, not just from today, but from everything that had come before. Attention surged when something was revealed, but it only endured when it was fed. And she had chosen, long ago, not to feed it. And across the room, her assistant approached again, this time without hesitation, placing a folder on her desk. "These are the finalized agreements from the foundation," she said, her tone steady, and Emily opened it briefly, scanning the contents with a practiced eye, the numbers, the commitments, the structure of something designed to extend beyond personal gain, and she nodded once, approving without ceremony, because this was the real outcome, not the headlines, not the whispered conversations, but the tangible impact of what had been, built in silence. And as she closed the folder, her gaze lifted briefly toward the window, where the city moved on, unchanged, unaware of the quiet shifts that defined it. And she thought, not of the night before, but of the years that had led to this point, the moments where she had chosen to step forward instead of shrinking back, the time she had built instead of reacting. And it became clear that none of it had been about a single turning point. It had been about consistency, about refusing to remain in a space that no longer reflected who she was becoming. And Alexander stepped closer then, his presence marking a pause in the flow of the day. Not to interrupt, but to acknowledge, "The board has confirmed the expansion," he said, his voice even, and Emily met his gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. Because this was not a surprise, it was. The next step, the continuation of something already set in motion, and she inclined her head slightly. "Then we move forward," she replied, her tone calm, certain, and that was it. No hesitation, no need to revisit what had already been decided, because the path ahead had always been clearer than the one behind. And as the day began to edge toward evening, the office gradually settled, conversation softening, lights dimming slightly as the work reached its natural pause, and Emily remained where she was for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on the desk, her gaze steady, not reflecting, not revisiting, simply present. And in that stillness, one truth remained unmistakable. Everything that had once been used to define her had lost its place, not because it had been erased, but because it no longer held any authority over who she had become. And as she finally stepped away, moving toward the next part of her day with the same quiet certainty, it was clear that the story had not ended with what others had witnessed. It had simply continued, on her terms, exactly as it was always meant to.